On the morning of March 14, 1957, Margaret Hoffman pushed through the brass-handled doors of the Walt Disney Studios in Burbank, California, carrying a canvas bag filled with animation cells and a thermos of coffee that had already gone cold during her commute from Pasadena. The smell of fresh paint and pencil shavings greeted her as it did every weekday morning, mingling with the faint scent of developer fluid from the camera department down the hall. She believed, as did everyone in the bustling animation building, that the most dangerous thing about working at Disney was missing a deadline or accidentally spilling ink on a nearly finished background painting. Within 3 months, Margaret would learn that the real danger had been sitting at the desk directly across from hers, wearing a pleasant smile and sketching cartoon rabbits while photographing classified documents in the studio's basement. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Margaret had joined Disney in 1952, one of a small but growing number of women in the animation department during an era when most studios still relegated female artists to the ink and paint divisions. At 31 years old, she had worked her way up from doing in-between drawings to being entrusted with character design work on Sleeping Beauty, the ambitious production that had consumed the studio's creative energies for the past 4 years. Her desk sat in a sun-filled corner of the 3rd floor, positioned beside a tall window that overlooked the Burbank Hills, and on clear days provided a glimpse of the San Gabriel Mountains rising in the distance like a painted backdrop. The woman who sat across from Margaret was named Helen Grayson, or at least that was the name she had given when she was hired in 1955. Helen was 43 years old, with graying blonde hair she wore pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of unremarkable face that people struggled to remember even after multiple conversations. She spoke with what she claimed was a Chicago accent, though Margaret sometimes detected odd inflections that seemed vaguely European. Helen worked as a background artist, creating the detailed scenery paintings that would later be photographed and combined with character animation. Her work was competent but never exceptional, the kind of steady, reliable output that kept projects moving forward without drawing particular attention. What Margaret did not know, what none of her colleagues knew, was that Helen Grayson was actually Elena Volkov, a Soviet intelligence operative who had entered the United States in 1953, using forged documents that identified her as a Canadian citizen. Elena had been trained at a facility outside Moscow for 2 years before her deployment, learning not only flawless English, but also the technical skills of animation and illustration that would allow her to blend seamlessly into the American film industry. Her mission had nothing to do with cartoon princesses or singing animals. The Walt Disney Studios, like many entertainment companies in Southern California during the 1950s, also maintained contracts with the United States military and defense contractors, producing training films, instructional materials, and occasionally allowing their facilities to be used for classified briefings and presentations. The Cold War had transformed America into a nation of secrets and suspicions. Following the Soviet Union's successful test of an atomic bomb in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, paranoia about communist infiltration had reached fever pitch. The House Un-American Activities Committee had already torn through Hollywood in the late 1940s and early 50s, destroying careers and forcing artists to name colleagues as suspected communists. While the worst of that particular witch hunt had passed by the time Eleanor arrived, the underlying anxiety remained. Defense facilities across California operated under heightened security, and companies like Disney that held even minor military contracts were expected to maintain strict protocols about who had access to their buildings and materials. Eleanor's assignment was to gather intelligence about a specific project codenamed Operation Talisman, a joint venture between the Air Force and several private contractors to develop advanced aerial reconnaissance systems. The technical meetings for this project were being held at various locations around Southern California, and the Disney Studios, with its screening rooms and large conference facilities, had been selected to host a series of briefings scheduled for the spring of 1957. Elena's handlers in Moscow Center had learned about these meetings through another source and had positioned her at Disney specifically to gain access to the materials that would be discussed. Her job was simple: attend any meetings she could access under her cover as a studio employee, photograph any documents she could obtain, and transmit the information through a courier system that ran from Los Angeles to Mexico City and eventually back to the Soviet Union. For 2 years, Elena had lived her double life with extraordinary discipline. She rented a small apartment in Glendale, attended church on Sundays to maintain her cover as a devout Christian, and had even dated a sound engineer from Warner Brothers for several months before ending the relationship, citing her dedication to her work. At the studio, she arrived promptly at 8 o'clock each morning, ate lunch in the commissary with her colleagues, and participated in the casual conversations about movies, television shows, and the rising cost of housing in Los Angeles. She learned to laugh at the right moments, to express appropriate enthusiasm when Walt Disney himself occasionally walked through the animation building, and to deflect personal questions with vague but believable answers about her past in Chicago and her non-existent family. Margaret Hoffman, by contrast, was exactly what she appeared to be. Born in Pasadena to a father who taught mathematics at Caltech and a mother who had worked as a librarian before Margaret's birth, she had grown up surrounded by books, art supplies, and the quiet encouragement to pursue whatever interested her. She had discovered animation through a high school field trip to the Disney Studios in 1943, had studied illustration at Chouinard Art Institute, and had submitted her portfolio to Disney 17 times before finally being hired. She lived with 2 roommates in a rented house in Pasadena, spent her weekends sketching at Griffith Park or attending concerts at the Hollywood Bowl, and had recently started dating a United States Navy officer named Tom Bradley, who was stationed at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. It was Tom who inadvertently set in motion the events that would unravel Elena's carefully constructed cover. On a Saturday evening in early March, Tom and Margaret had dinner at a restaurant in Santa Monica, and during their conversation, Tom mentioned that he would be attending some briefings at the Disney Studios later that month. The Navy was collaborating with the Air Force on aspects of Operation Talisman, and Tom, as a specialist in communications systems, had been assigned to participate in several technical sessions. He spoke about it casually, not revealing any classified details, but mentioning it as an interesting change from his usual routine at the shipyard. Margaret, excited by the coincidence, mentioned that she might see him at the studio during his visit. She thought nothing more of the conversation until the following Monday, when she arrived at work and noticed Helen Grayson asking pointed questions about upcoming events at the studio. Helen wanted to know if there were any special projects or visitors expected, if any of the screening rooms would be occupied, if security procedures would be changing. Her questions seemed innocent enough, framed as curiosity about whether the studio's normal routine would be disrupted, but something about Helen's intensity struck Margaret as slightly off. It was the first time in 2 years of working together that Helen had shown any particular interest in anything beyond her immediate work assignments. Margaret mentioned it to Tom during their next phone conversation, describing it as a funny quirk rather than anything concerning. But Tom, trained in security protocols through his military service, immediately became alert. He asked Margaret to describe Helen in detail, to recall anything unusual about her behavior or background. Margaret, surprised by his seriousness, struggled to remember specifics. Helen was just Helen, unremarkable and consistent, the kind of colleague who blended into the background of daily work life. But as Margaret searched her memory, small details began to surface. Helen never talked about friends or family. She had never invited anyone from work to visit her apartment. Her stories about growing up in Chicago were detailed, but somehow generic, lacking the specific texture of real memories. And once, several months earlier, Margaret had noticed Helen reading a newspaper in Russian during her lunch break. When Margaret had asked about it, Helen had explained that she was trying to learn the language to better understand the political situation in Europe, but the explanation had seemed oddly defensive. Tom asked Margaret not to mention their conversation to anyone, and certainly not to confront Helen about anything. Instead, he said he would make some inquiries through official channels. The United States military in 1957 maintained close relationships with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. particularly regarding matters of potential espionage around defense installations and contractors. Tom submitted a routine security query through his commanding officer, noting the presence of an employee at Disney Studios who had aroused mild suspicion through questions about military visitors. Given the heightened security environment of the era, such queries were taken seriously. The FBI's Los Angeles field office assigned a young agent named Robert Kellerman to conduct a preliminary investigation. Kellerman was 29 years old, had joined the Bureau in 1954 after graduating from law school, and had spent most of his career investigating mundane cases of interstate fraud and minor corruption. The idea of uncovering an actual Soviet spy seemed absurdly unlikely to him, something from the pages of sensational magazines rather than the reality of sleepy Burbank. Nevertheless, he followed protocol. He requested employee records from Disney Studios, conducted discreet interviews with studio security personnel, and ran Helen Grayson's name and background through federal databases. What he found made his pulse quicken. Helen Grayson's Canadian birth certificate, upon closer examination by document experts, showed subtle signs of forgery. The paper stock was correct for the stated year of issue, but certain watermarks and registration numbers did not match Canadian government records. Her entry into the United States in 1953 had been logged at a border crossing in North Dakota, but immigration officials there had no specific memory of her, and the supporting documentation seemed suspiciously minimal. Most tellingly, her employment history before joining Disney consisted of a series of positions that either could not be verified or were at companies that had since closed, leaving no records to confirm her claims. Kellerman brought his findings to his supervisor, who escalated the matter to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. Within 48 hours, Helen Grayson was under active surveillance. FBI agents photographed her entering and leaving her apartment, followed her on her daily commute to Burbank, and documented her movements during evenings and weekends. They discovered that twice a week, on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, Helen drove to different locations around Los Angeles, always parking on residential streets and walking for several blocks before returning to her car. The pattern suggested counter-surveillance behavior, the kind of precautions a trained intelligence operative would take before meeting a contact or servicing a dead drop. The FBI decided to let the operation continue under observation rather than making an immediate arrest. If Helen was indeed a Soviet spy, she might lead them to other members of her network, potentially uncovering a larger espionage ring operating in Southern California. They also wanted to catch her in the act of actually obtaining classified information, which would provide incontrovertible evidence for prosecution. The briefings for Operation Talisman were scheduled to begin on March 25th, and the FBI planned to watch carefully to see what Helen would do. Margaret Hoffman knew nothing about any of this. Tom had told her only that he had reported the information and that she should continue her normal routine at work without acting any differently around Helen. For Margaret, this was nearly impossible. Every interaction with Helen now felt charged with hidden meaning. When Helen asked to borrow a pencil, Margaret wondered if it was some kind of coded signal. When Helen complimented a background painting Margaret had completed, Margaret searched the words for double meanings. The strain of pretending everything was normal while suspecting her colleague of being a foreign spy began to affect Margaret's sleep and her work. She made uncharacteristic mistakes in her drawings, arriving at the studio each morning, already exhausted from a night of anxious speculation. On March 22nd, 3 days before the scheduled briefings, Helen Grayson made her move. The Disney Studios maintained a document storage room in the basement of the main animation building, a climate-controlled space where finished artwork, storyboards, and various project materials were archived. Because the studio also produced military training films, this storage area also occasionally held classified materials waiting to be returned to government facilities. Helen had slowly, over the course of 2 years, established a pattern of volunteering to retrieve archived artwork for reference, giving her legitimate reasons to access the storage room. The studio's security guard, a genial retired policeman named Frank Morrison, had long since stopped paying close attention to Helen's trips to the basement. She was just another artist looking for old backgrounds to reference for current projects. On that Friday afternoon, Helen told Margaret and the other artists in their section that she needed to find some forest backgrounds from an earlier film to use as reference for a scene she was developing. She gathered her reference portfolio and headed downstairs. What she actually intended to do was search for any preliminary materials related to Operation Talisman that might have been delivered to the studio in preparation for the upcoming meetings. Soviet intelligence had trained her in lockpicking, and she had already identified the filing cabinet where such materials would likely be stored. What Helen did not know was that FBI agents had been inside the Disney studios since early that morning, installing listening devices and camera equipment in the storage room. They had also briefed Frank Morrison on the situation, transforming the friendly security guard into a key participant in a counterintelligence operation. When Helen descended the stairs and signed the access log, Morrison's hand was positioned near a hidden alarm button that would alert the FBI agent stationed in an unmarked van outside the building. Helen entered the storage room, her heartbeat accelerating despite her years of training. The room smelled of paper and chemicals, with rows of filing cabinets lining one wall and stacks of archived artwork arranged on wide, flat drawers. She moved to the section she had scouted previously, where materials related to military contracts were stored. Using a tension wrench and pick she had concealed in her portfolio, she worked on the lock of the cabinet marked with security classifications. Her hands, steady and practiced, had the lock open in less than 45 seconds. Inside, she found exactly what she had been sent to obtain: preliminary technical specifications for the reconnaissance systems that would be discussed during the upcoming briefings, including detailed schematics and performance analyses. She removed a miniature camera from a hollowed-out section of her portfolio, a sophisticated German-made device that Soviet intelligence had provided through their East Berlin station. She began photographing the documents, working quickly and methodically, checking the exposure settings with each shot to ensure the technical diagrams would be clearly readable in the developed images. Upstairs, Margaret was finishing a particularly difficult piece of character animation when she realized she had left her favorite brush in the storage room during an earlier trip that week. It was nearly 5 o'clock, close to the end of the workday, but she wanted the brush for work she planned to do over the weekend. Without thinking much about it, she headed downstairs. Frank Morrison, focused on monitoring Helen's activities through a subtle observation system the FBI had installed, did not notice Margaret approaching until she was already at the door to the storage room. Margaret pushed open the door and stopped abruptly. Helen was standing at an open filing cabinet, holding what was clearly not a background painting, but a technical document covered in diagrams and classification stamps. More striking was the small camera in Helen's other hand, positioned as though she had just finished taking a photograph. For a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, the two women stared at each other. Margaret's mind struggled to process what she was seeing, to reconcile the mundane Helen she had worked beside for 2 years with this figure caught in an act of obvious espionage. Helen moved first. She dropped the camera into her portfolio and attempted to close the filing cabinet, her expression shifting from shock to a cold calculation that Margaret had never seen before. Her voice, when she spoke, had lost all trace of the Midwestern accent she normally maintained. "You should not have come down here," Helen said quietly. Her tone carried a warning, but also a strange sadness, as if she regretted that Margaret had stumbled into this moment. Margaret's response came from pure instinct rather than thought. "What are you doing?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The question gave her time to process, to decide what to do next. Helen took a step toward the door, toward Margaret, and that movement triggered Margaret's survival reflexes. Margaret turned and ran back into the hallway, shouting for Frank Morrison. Her voice echoed through the basement corridor, high and frightened and utterly convinced that she had just discovered something terrible. The FBI agents were through the building's side entrance in seconds. They had been waiting for Helen to complete her photography and leave the building, hoping to catch her making contact with whoever would receive the film. But Margaret's interruption had forced their hand. They reached the storage room just as Helen was attempting to follow Margaret out. The arrest was quick and professional. Helen did not resist. She simply stood still, her hands at her sides, her face settling into an expression of resigned disappointment. The camera and the photographed documents were secured as evidence. Helen Grayson, who was actually Elena Volkov, was taken into federal custody. Margaret, shaking and confused, was escorted to an office upstairs where FBI agents spent the next 3 hours questioning her about her interactions with Helen. They wanted to know everything. Every conversation, every observation, every moment that might provide insight into Helen's activities or contacts. Margaret answered as best she could, still struggling to understand how she had worked beside a Soviet spy for 2 years without suspecting anything amiss. The agents assured her that she had done nothing wrong, that in fact, her boyfriend's security awareness and her own observations had been crucial to uncovering a significant intelligence operation. Over the following weeks, as the FBI's investigation expanded, the full scope of Helen's activities became clear. She was part of a larger spy ring operating across Southern California, a network that had been gathering intelligence on aerospace developments, military installations, and defense research programs throughout the 1950s. The ring included at least 6 other operatives, including a machinist at Lockheed Aircraft in Burbank, a secretary at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, and a graduate student in physics at UCLA who had access to professors working on classified research. All of them were arrested within days of Helen's capture, as the FBI moved quickly to dismantle the network before its members could flee or destroy evidence. The revelation that Soviet spies had been operating inside the Disney studios sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry and the defense establishment. Walt Disney himself was reportedly furious that his studio had been compromised, and he immediately ordered a complete review of security procedures. The fact that the infiltration had been discovered not through sophisticated counterintelligence work, but through a young woman's casual observation and her boyfriend's proper reporting of suspicions became a teaching example in FBI training programs. Sometimes, the most sophisticated espionage operations were undone by the simplest human errors: a question asked too insistently, a newspaper in the wrong language, a colleague who happened to open the wrong door at the wrong moment. Helen or Elena never went to trial. In a pattern that was common during the Cold War, she was held for several months of intensive interrogation, during which FBI counterintelligence officers attempted to turn her into a double agent. She refused all such offers. In November of 1957, she was exchanged for 2 American intelligence officers who had been captured in East Germany, traded at the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin in a carefully choreographed swap supervised by both governments. Before she left American custody, Eleanor asked to send a message to Margaret Hoffman. The FBI delivered it, a handwritten note on plain paper. The note read, "I am sorry you were caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with you. You were always kind to me, even when you had no reason to be. In another world, in another life, we might have actually been friends. I wish you well with your drawings and your naval officer, Elena." Margaret kept the note for the rest of her life, though she never showed it to anyone except Tom, who she married in 1958. The apology, if that was what it was, felt both genuine and utterly insufficient. How could you apologize for lying about your entire existence, for using kindness and friendship as tools of deception, for stealing secrets that might have endangered thousands of lives? Yet Margaret found herself unable to simply hate Eleanor. The woman she had known as Helen had been courteous, helpful, and pleasant to work with, even if every single aspect of that persona had been constructed as a cover. The cognitive dissonance of reconciling the spy with the colleague troubled Margaret for years. The story of the Disney spy ring, as it came to be known in FBI circles, remained classified for decades. The studio, anxious to avoid publicity that might damage its family-friendly reputation, cooperated with federal requests to keep the matter quiet. The arrested spies either left the country through exchanges or, in the case of those who were American citizens recruited by Soviet intelligence, served prison terms without their cases making headlines. The full details did not become public until the 1990s, when declassified FBI files and Soviet archives revealed the extent of espionage activities in the American entertainment industry during the Cold War. Margaret continued working at Disney until 1964, contributing to Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, and early work on The Jungle Book, before leaving the studio to focus on raising her children. She and Tom had 3 daughters, and Margaret maintained her art practice throughout her life, teaching drawing classes and occasionally selling her paintings at local galleries. She rarely spoke about the spy incident, deflecting questions when former colleagues brought it up at studio reunions. It was simply too strange, too disconnected from her understanding of her own life, to integrate into casual conversation. Tom Bradley rose through the ranks of the Navy, eventually retiring as a captain after 30 years of service. He maintained throughout his life that the Disney case had taught him the most important lesson of his intelligence career, that vigilance did not require paranoia, that reasonable awareness of anomalies and proper reporting of concerns through established channels could prevent serious security breaches without destroying the fabric of normal society. He gave occasional lectures at naval intelligence training courses, using the case as an example of how security is ultimately a shared responsibility between military personnel and the civilians they are meant to protect. The broader implications of the Disney spy ring extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The case demonstrated that Soviet intelligence services had successfully penetrated not just government agencies and military facilities, but also the civilian infrastructure that supported defense work. Entertainment companies, universities, research institutions, and private corporations all became targets for infiltration, not because of what they did primarily, but because of the occasional contract, the visiting researcher, the temporary use of a facility that brought them into contact with classified information. The diffuse nature of the American defense establishment, spread across thousands of institutions and millions of employees, made it both incredibly resilient and incredibly vulnerable to espionage. The Disney case also highlighted the human cost of Cold War espionage, not just for the spies themselves, but for the ordinary people whose lives intersected with theirs. Margaret never fully recovered her sense of certainty about her ability to judge character. If she could work beside a Soviet spy for 2 years and see nothing but a pleasant colleague, what else might she be missing? The experience introduced a permanent note of doubt into her interactions, a small voice that questioned whether people were really who they claimed to be. It was an unfair burden, the residue of betrayal even in a relationship that had never been real, but it marked her nonetheless. Frank Morrison, the security guard who had been present during the arrest, found his remaining years at Disney shadowed by the incident. He retired in 1960 and spent his final years fishing in Oregon, rarely discussing his decades in security work. The one time a local newspaper interviewed him about his career, he mentioned that the most important thing he had learned was that security was not about being suspicious of everyone, but about being observant of everything. There was a difference, he said, between paranoia and awareness, and finding that balance was the real challenge. The members of the spy ring who were arrested alongside Elena faced varying fates. The American citizens among them received prison sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years, though several were released early as Cold War tensions eventually eased. The foreign operatives were exchanged or deported, returning to the Soviet Union where they received mixed receptions. Some were celebrated as heroes who had served their country under difficult circumstances. Others were quietly reassigned to desk jobs, their failures to avoid detection marking them as unreliable for future field work. Elena Volkov lived in Moscow until her death in 1993, working as a translator and instructor for Soviet intelligence services. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, she gave one interview to a Russian newspaper in which she expressed neither regret nor pride about her espionage career, describing it simply as the work she had been trained to do in service of a cause she had believed in at the time. The documents Elena had photographed in that basement storage room at Disney never reached Moscow. The film was confiscated during her arrest, and the Operation Talisman program proceeded without compromise. The reconnaissance systems developed through that project remained in service throughout the 1960s, contributing to intelligence gathering efforts during various Cold War crises. Whether the information would have made a significant difference to Soviet military capabilities remains a matter of historical debate. Some intelligence historians argue that by 1957, Soviet technical capabilities were advancing rapidly enough that stolen American specifications provided marginal rather than transformative advantages. Others contend that every piece of classified information obtained by hostile intelligence services potentially endangered American lives and strategic interests, regardless of how quickly it became outdated. What remains undisputed is that the exposure of the ring had a chilling effect on Soviet intelligence operations in Southern California. The FBI's success in identifying and dismantling the network forced Soviet handlers to reconsider their approaches, to assume that their operational security had been more thoroughly compromised than they had realized. For several years after the Disney case, Soviet espionage activities in the Los Angeles area contracted significantly as the intelligence services worked to rebuild their networks with new personnel and more cautious procedures. The story also became part of the mythology of the FBI's counterintelligence efforts, taught to new agents as an example of how intelligence successes often resulted from patient investigation of small anomalies rather than dramatic confrontations. The image of a young animator stumbling upon a spy photographing documents in a basement storage room became a reminder that espionage was ultimately a human activity, subject to all the accidents and coincidences that characterized human existence. No amount of training or preparation could entirely eliminate the possibility that someone would open the wrong door at the wrong moment. For Margaret, the long-term impact was more personal than professional. She developed a fascination with Cold War history, reading extensively about espionage, intelligence services, and the ideological conflicts that had led people like Elena to risk everything for political causes. She tried to understand what would drive someone to abandon their country, learn a new identity, and spend years living a lie in service of an abstract political system. The more she read, the more complex her feelings about Elena became. Anger at the deception remained, but it was joined by a kind of reluctant respect for the discipline and dedication required to maintain such a cover, and a sadness for the emptiness of a life built entirely on pretense. In 1978, 21 years after the incident, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It had been posted from Mexico City and contained no return address. The handwriting was immediately familiar, the same neat script she had seen on countless background painting labels at Disney. The letter was brief. "I am told you married your naval officer and have children. I hope your life has been full and happy. I have often thought about that afternoon in the storage room and wondered what you must have thought of me. I want you to know that my kindness toward you was not entirely false. In the midst of necessary deception, there were moments of genuine regard. I suspect this matters little to you, but I wanted you to know. Elena." Margaret never responded. She showed the letter to Tom, who advised against any reply that might be used by intelligence services on either side. But she kept the letter, placing it with the earlier note in a box of personal papers that her daughters would eventually discover after her death. Reading those letters years later, Margaret's daughters struggled to understand their mother's decision to preserve them. Why keep mementos from someone who had so thoroughly betrayed any claim to friendship? But Margaret had understood something her daughters, growing up after the Cold War had ended, could not fully grasp: that the world of espionage existed in shades of grey that simple moral categories could not adequately capture. The Disney studios eventually became more cautious about security, implementing background checks and restricted access protocols that became standard across the entertainment industry. The era of casual access to facilities, when an artist could simply walk into a storage room without supervision, ended. Some who had worked at the studio during its earlier, more informal period mourned the loss of that openness, viewing it as another casualty of Cold War anxieties. Others recognized it as a necessary adaptation to a world where the line between entertainment and national security had become unexpectedly blurred. Walt Disney himself never publicly commented on the spy ring incident, but those close to him reported that it reinforced his already conservative political views and his suspicions about communist infiltration of American institutions. In the years following the arrests, Disney became more vocal in his support for strong defense policies and more willing to cooperate with government security initiatives. Whether this represented a genuine shift in his views or simply a more public expression of beliefs he had always held became a subject of debate among biographers and historians. The broader Cold War context in which the Disney spy ring operated eventually faded into history. The intense ideological struggles of the 1950s gave way to détente in the 1970s, then to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The generation that had lived through those years of mutual suspicion and nuclear anxiety gradually passed, replaced by new generations for whom the Cold War was history rather than lived experience. But the stories remained, preserved in declassified documents, in FBI training materials, and in the memories of people like Margaret Hoffman Bradley, who had stumbled accidentally into a world of secrets and lies. Margaret died in 2009 at the age of 83, surrounded by her family in the same Pasadena house where she had lived for 40 years. Among her possessions, her daughters found not only the letters from Elena, but also a collection of newspaper clippings about Cold War espionage cases, carefully preserved and annotated. There were articles about the Rosenberg spy ring, about Alger Hiss, about Rudolf Abel and the U-2 incident, about all the various ways in which the conflict between superpowers had played out through individual human dramas. In the margins, Margaret had written occasional notes, questions about motivations, observations about consequences, reflections on the nature of loyalty and betrayal. One clipping in particular caught her daughter's attention. It was an obituary from a Russian newspaper, published in 1993, announcing the death of Elena Volkov, described as a retired translator and former intelligence officer. Someone had translated the Russian text into English and added it to the clipping. The obituary mentioned Elena's service during the Cold War, her years living undercover in America, and her return to Moscow. It noted that she had never married and had no children. In the margin beside this obituary, Margaret had written a single sentence. She gave everything to a cause that ultimately failed and had nothing left for herself. Whether this represented pity, judgment, or simple observation, Margaret's daughters could not determine. Perhaps it was all three, the complex reaction of someone who had been tangentially caught in the machinery of Cold War espionage and had spent decades trying to understand her accidental role in it. Margaret had been neither hero nor victim in any conventional sense, simply a person who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or depending on perspective, the right place at the right time. Her interruption of Elena's photography session had exposed a spy ring, protected classified information, and contributed to national security. Yet she had never sought that role, never wanted to be part of the hidden war being waged in storage rooms and basement archives. The Disney spy ring case remained a footnote in Cold War history, less famous than the atomic spies or the Cambridge Five, but nonetheless significant as an example of how thoroughly Soviet intelligence had penetrated American society. It demonstrated that the conflict between the superpowers was not confined to official channels and military installations, but seeped into every corner of national life, from university research departments to entertainment studios. The very diffusion of the American system, which made it resistant to any single catastrophic failure, also created countless small vulnerabilities that patient, dedicated intelligence operations could exploit. In the end, the story of how a Disney employee accidentally exposed a Soviet spy ring became a story about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, about the small choices and random chances that determined the outcomes of covert operations, and about the personal costs of political conflicts. Margaret's decision to retrieve a forgotten brush, Elena's urgency to photograph documents before the briefings began, Tom's appropriate reporting of his girlfriend's casual observation, these mundane actions combined to unravel years of careful preparation and strategic planning. It was a reminder that for all the sophistication of intelligence tradecraft and counterintelligence operations, the human element remained unpredictable and ultimately decisive. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.